Carolyn Gramling, Earth and Climate writer for Science News. In honor of the 100th anniversary of our independent news organization, we are interviewing leaders in science on the big questions in their fields. Here we're going to be talking about climate change communication. That can include not only ongoing research on how best to inoculate people against climate science misinformation, but also how to just engage with people on this topic in these highly polarized times. My guest today is Ed Maybach, who is the director of the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. Dr. Maybach researches public understanding of and engagement in climate change and looks for ways to enhance both that understanding and that engagement. Along with his colleague, Anthony Leiserowitz at Yale, Dr. Maybach received the Stephen Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Science Communication in 2020. And this is work that is needed now more than ever. So, Dr. Maybach, thank you so much for joining us. So, in my introduction, I mentioned these highly polarized times, but of course, that's an oversimplification. People aren't just one thing or the other. And as you and your colleagues reported about a decade ago, there aren't just two perspectives on global warming in the United States. You identified 6 distinct perspectives in the U.S. on that subject.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have it exactly right, Carolyn. It's like when I started working on climate change almost 15 years ago now, um, that sort of the lore out there was that there are sort of just two beliefs, and I'm using that word beliefs very intentionally here. It drives some of my climate science colleagues nuts when they hear me talk about beliefs, because their business is evidence and facts, not beliefs. But nevertheless, the rest of us, we hold beliefs about what we think our climate scientists have concluded. And the lore was 15 years ago, there were two types of Americans: those who believed that global warming was real and human caused and serious, and those who chose not to believe that. And that just struck Tony and I as pretty patently absurd. Of course, there has to be more nuance than that. So we did something that in the marketing field they call audience segmentation analysis. It's pretty simple. It's just using statistical data, people's answers to our surveys, and then running it through a statistical algorithm to look for people whose answers cluster together, whose answers are similar to one another. And what we found essentially was that there are six distinct groups. We call them global warming, 6 Americas. And it's been absolutely fascinating to watch those 6 groups evolve over the past. We first identified them in the spring of 2009, so we've been able to watch them evolve over the past 12 years. And over the past 5 or 6 years, it's what's been particularly most notable is that the Americans who were least inclined to believe that human-caused climate change is real, we call them, in fact, they're not inclined at all to believe. They're quite firm in their convictions that global warming is a scam, essentially. And that segment of the public about 5 or 6 years ago was approximately 1 out of 10. 12% exactly. And over the ensuing 5 or 6 years, they have contracted. They're now down to about 7%. That's something we didn't expect to see, because when people hold their views strongly, they tend to hold them dearly as well. They're not willing to relinquish their views, change their views. But at the same time, during that same time period, the group on the other end of the 6 Americas continuum, which we call the alarmed, again, about 1 out of 10, 5 or 6 years ago, 12% exactly, they have grown enormously. Well in excess of 25% now. Probably, we're about to release our latest data, probably 3 in 10, 30%. So there's been this enormous growth in the proportion of Americans who are concerned, really deeply concerned about climate change.
So I'm just going to give people a little the 6 categories that you identified. You mentioned a few of them. So it goes from alarmed to concerned to cautious, disengaged, which I guess are the people who just really don't have an opinion one way or the other or feel uninformed about it. I don't know if that's accurate.
That's correct.
And then there's doubtful, and then dismissive. And when you're doing these surveys like twice a year since 2008 when you did the first one, is that right?
That's right.
So that's why you're doing this. You're able to do this sort of longitudinal, like, let's track how these attitudes have changed. And I was interested to read that it wasn't just sort of like this uptick. It was like there was a dip and then it went back up again over time. There was a dip around 2010, 2011. So if you can sort of talk about like what are the things that are driving those trends in people's perceptions in your viewpoint?
Yeah, it's a very good observation. It hasn't been a single linear trend, either upward or downward. There's been a lot of wiggling in those trend lines. And the very first notable thing that we observed was between our first and our second survey. So between the fall of 2008 and early winter 2010, we didn't have the funding yet in place to do surveys every 6 months. So it was essentially a year 14 months between the first two surveys. But our timing was absolutely fortuitous in the sense that we caught the high watermark of public concern about climate change in the fall of 2008. If you look at Gallup polls and Pew polls that came prior to ours, they were showing a sort of a long, steady growth. And we jumped into this polling process right around the time of the high watermark. And
Was it
then
like An Inconvenient Truth was the year before, right? So it was like right around that peak of interest and knowledge, maybe.
Yeah, An Inconvenient Truth was, I guess, 2006, perhaps. So
Okay.
several
Yeah.
years prior. What was actually going on were two things. I mean, a lot of things were going on, but two things in particular that I think drove this dramatic downturn in public concern about climate change between the fall of 2008 and the winter of 2010. The first one was the financial markets melting down in America and around the world. So, if you recall, lots of people were their mortgages were underwater. They were losing their jobs. It was really a terrible time. Um, but something else important happened at that time, and it was called the Waxman Marquis bill, and namely a comprehensive climate legislation passed in the U.S. House of Representatives, and it was then it was going to become the job of the U.S. Senate to essentially also ratify a bill and come up with a reconciliation and move comprehensive climate legislation forward to the president's desk. And the president, of course, that was President Obama, he would have signed it. What happened in response to the Waxman Markey bill is the climate denial machine kicked into high gear, like ludicrous speed, if I can use a Mel Brooks reference here. um,
Right.
so
Spaceballs. Got it.
Spaceballs, thank you, exactly right. So that the climate disinformation machine is incredibly well funded, incredibly disciplined, and when they kick into ludicrous speed, it's going to have an impact. And in fact, that's exactly the impact we saw between 2008 and 2010.
And so that sort of dovetailed with the rise of the Tea Party as well as a political powerhouse, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah. But now we're seeing this like swing back up and in fact past the point of 2008 as far as the alarmed and the concerned
That's
fraction or
right.
share.
That's
Yeah.
right. So really, for the past 10 years, it hasn't been a perfect incremental increase, but for the past 10 years, there has been this pretty dramatic growth in public engagement on all of the indicators that we are, that our research shows are most important. People, which we boil down to, by the way, 5 key indicators, okay? Because there are really only 5 what we call essential truths that when people understand them, when Americans understand them, it differentiates those people who are quite concerned about the problem and are starting to take action themselves from those people who aren't concerned or aren't taking action. And those 5 essential truths are: it's real, meaning global warming is real; it's us, it's human caused; experts agree, there's virtually no disagreement among the climate science community about the reality of human-caused climate change; it's bad, meaning it's bad for polar plants, penguins, and polar bears, but it's bad for people too. It's really important for people to understand it's not just a threat to, charismatic species up in the far north, but in fact, it's changing conditions in our backyard. And then finally, there's hope, right? So for people who feel like the horse has left the barn, there's nothing we can do about this. In the words of some of my most beloved climate scientist friends who like to shorthand it as "we're effed," they say, no, it's true. We are in for a world of pain, but the degree to which we are effed depends on whether or not we respond to this. And so people who feel like there is no hope are not likely to be rolling up their sleeves and getting engaged and championing or personally engaging in climate solutions.
I have to say, when you said "there's hope," those two words, I immediately like took a deep breath and went, "Okay." um, so yeah, as a climate change reporter over the last decade and a half now, I guess, yeah, I've seen sort of this change in terms of where people seem to be standing in terms of denial, outright denial. Um, and for me, I can sort of recognize what I think of as inflection points there, where it's like, okay, the 2018 special report from the IPCC on the 1.5 degree study. That seemed like a thing that really got people's attention, suggesting that 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, there's quantifiable differences, and here's what they are. And then, the youth climate movement in 2019. But your data seem to suggest that this change was actually starting a little bit earlier than that people were becoming more engaged and more aware even before 2018. So I was curious, what are the things that might be driving that particular tick upward?
I suspect most Americans have paid a lot more attention to the youth climate
Hmm.
movement and to young Greta Thunberg from Sweden than they have paid to the IPCC's
Yeah, that's probably
1.5
true.
degree special report. I personally pay a lot of attention to the IPCC 1.5 degree report because it's such an important statement that they made. Because the statement, I'm sorry, I'm answering a slightly different question than you asked me, but I'm going with it anyway. Uh, um, the reason why the 1.5 degree report was so important is because the uh, all countries in the world, minus ours during the Trump administration, but now once again we're back in the Paris Climate Agreement, and all countries in the world have agreed to work together to try to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees centigrade. And yet they were smart enough, insightful enough to ask the IPCC, is that actually safe? That 2 degrees turned out to be a politically expedient number, a number that all the nations could agree on, but it really wasn't clear as to whether or not that was a safe level of warming. And so they asked the scientists of the world in the form of the IPCC to do a special report on exactly that. What is the difference for our children and our grandchildren and their children and grandchildren, etc., if we limit the warming to 1.5 degrees or if we let it go all the way up to 2 degrees? God forbid we don't go beyond that. And what they found was that it's really, the difference is quite profound. The public health, I'm a public health professional by training, so I tend to think of all of this in public health terms. The public health consequences of letting the warming get to 2 degrees as opposed to 1.5 degrees is pretty consequential. Not, I shouldn't say pretty, is extremely consequential. There will be a lot more public health harm if the world warms to 2 degrees than if we succeed in limiting the warming to 1.5 degree. And I do think, so now coming back to answer your question, I do think the public has paid attention to young voices, which is good. There are children, there are grandchildren. We should pay attention to them. They're speaking truth to power. And in fact, they're speaking science to power. I think young Greta is absolutely amazing in the way she speaks science to power. But I also think that America's health professionals have, by and large, started to wake up and talk about this issue, which I think helps as well. I can tell you for a fact that America's television weathercasters have really gotten in the game over the past 5, 6, 7 years. And so there are lots of new voices who the members of the public weren't previously hearing, who are now talking about climate change. And I think what we're seeing in terms of this dramatically heightened public engagement, I think we're seeing the sum total of all of these new voices who really, you could say they have ended the climate silence that was reigning in America up until about 5 or 6 years ago. Most people simply didn't talk about the issue. And we know that from our surveys. And we know from our surveys that most people don't hear anybody else talking about this climate change as an issue, whether that's professionals or whether it's their friends and family. So the fact that America has started a conversation about climate change is incredibly helpful, because we're not likely to stand up and do anything about our problems if we're not talking
Yeah, there
about
was
them.
a scientist I talked to back in 2019. It was Kim Cobb, actually, Georgia Tech, and she was mentioning, like, at that point after the youth climate movement, it just felt like suddenly this was a kitchen table discussion. It was something that people were sitting down and actually talking about amongst themselves, or in the grocery store or wherever, as opposed to just sort of some rarefied, distant thing. And it feels like the extreme weather events also, which were again emphasized by this year's IPCC report, to sort of bring it home to people, that seemed to also um, help help make it more real. I think, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So climate scientists have been telling us for a very long time that one of the ways that climate change is going to touch our lives first and most directly is through extreme weather. And uh, 10 years ago, when we asked people the question, have you personally experienced global warming? About 1 out of 4 people would say yes to that question. Now, about half of our polling respondents say yes to that question. And when we ask them, well, in what way have you personally experienced global warming? We see very clearly that more and more people are connecting the dots between the extreme weather events in their community and this thing that they've been hearing about called climate change.
Yeah, I was also really struck by the most recent report that updates the Six Americas, showed that the smallest fraction is now the disengaged fraction. That it just goes to show that more and more people are at least coming down on one side or the other, and mostly on the concerned or alarmed side.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really telling too.
There's not very there's fairly little demographic difference between the six Americas. The disengaged segment is the one sort of exception to that rule. They they have less household income. They're essentially a group of Americans who are working twice as hard just to keep paying the rent or keep paying the mortgage. And so the reason they are disengaged is not because they don't care, it's because they don't have time to actually pay attention to sort of the news that had they, if they did have more time, they might otherwise be paying attention to. So yes, the disengaged segment has shrunk considerably over the past decade. And although I don't actually know the numbers off the top of my head, I can tell you, rather than sort of inching along to the next group over, the cautious and then the concerned and then the alarmed, my guess is many of them jumped straight from the disengaged segment into the alarmed segment.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, so now that you have done this work to sort of know the audience, how is it helpful to develop climate communication strategies to be able to identify these different groups? How can you tailor different strategies to the different groups?
It's a great question, and to some degree, we do exactly that. But the biggest insight for me personally, in the Six Americas continuum, was the following realization: the alarm segment. Again, they've grown enormously. So when I first started thinking about the alarm segment, they weren't nearly as big and important as they are today. But even then, the goal there, the climate communication objective there shouldn't be to further worry them, because they're worried enough. It should actually be to help them understand the actions that they could take that will be really genuinely helpful. And we know from our polling that lots of people have even in the alarm segment, have a very unclear idea about what actions are going to be genuinely most helpful. So with regard to the alarm, we try to help organizations who are targeting the alarm segment understand, look, help these people figure out what's most important for them to do, because they want to take action. On the other end of the continuum, the dismissive segment, frankly, we don't go after them. We're not in the business of trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced of the truth. It's just really hard to do that. And if there are organizations who are um, trying to debunk the misinformation that characterizes their thinking, God bless them. That's not the way I choose to spend my time. I choose to spend my time on the four Americas in the middle of the continuum. And the reason is because to a greater or lesser degree, they already understand that the climate is changing. The group that we call the doubtful, which is right next to the dismissive, they tend to be skeptical, but they're still listening. They tell us very clearly in our surveys they are still open to learning more. And so just because they're a little skeptical now, as long as they're still open to learning more, I see that as a real opportunity. So the 4 segments in the middle of the continuum, we have spent a fair amount of our effort trying to build communication programs that reach out to them, that help them either understand, as I said before, that it's real, that it's us, that experts agree that it's bad, and there are actions we can take that will make a difference. For the segments who are already inclined to understand that it's happening, what our objective there is to help them realize this isn't only a future problem. This is today's problem. This problem is already changing conditions in your backyard, and in ways that, sometimes are nice. It's gorgeous where I live today. I went outside for a little while today, and I was just stunned at how lovely it is. I understand why it's so lovely, and the reason isn't good, but it is lovely today. So we try to help people understand, people who see climate change as a distant problem, distant in space, somewhere else, not here in my community, distant in time, 2050, 2100, yeah, but not 2021, and distant in species, polar bears, but not people. We try to help all of them realize, no, in fact, this is happening now, here in our community, to us, and it's not good for us. And we have, real strong reason to believe from our research that when people learn those facts, they learn the ways that it's changing, conditions are changing in their backyard now, and why that isn't good. It really it helps to heighten this public engagement that we've been talking about.
I was going to ask, I'll give you an opportunity to critique journalists. So this is obviously, I think in climate journalism, there's certainly been an increase in, recognition that we need to tell personal stories, local stories, bring it home to people in that way. And I'm curious, what do you think that climate journalists like me could be doing to tell this story in a way that might actually be impactful for that middle?
Yeah, like the old expression that all politics is local, I tend to think that, all climate change public engagement comes from local motivations. So I really do believe that we've got, Science News does wonderful climate journalism. The New York Times, the Washington Post are absolutely outstanding. The LA Times. We have some premier news journalistic outlets that are doing outstanding climate reporting. But I would like to see everyday news stations, both TV, radio, newspapers, digital news outlets. I'd like to see them covering climate change as a local issue, because people can only be expected to care so much or to pay so much attention when they learn about what's happening elsewhere, because they're primarily interested in what's happening here in our town. So I think we have a real profound need to help journalists around the country and around the world do highly engaging local climate reporting, contextualizing the global story in the form of local stories. What's happening here to us now?
So in the vein of, figuring out a way to bring the story and make it personal and relevant to individuals, I know that you have this story that you have told before, about a neighbor who you. I'm going to make you tell that story. Do you mind sharing that one again? I think it's really interesting.
I don't mind. I really ought to tell my neighbor
Okay.
that I'm sharing our story
Does she know that
publicly,
you talk about
but
this?
I actually don't think she would mind. So I've lived in this neighborhood for a good long time, more than 2 decades now. And for the first decade or so, a neighbor 2 doors down, her name is Nancy, she felt the need to remind me every time we talked that she is I'm forgetting what kind of Republican she tells me she is, but basically she
I
reminds
think
me.
you've said, I could just tell you, I think it was a Goldwater Republican,
Thank
is what
you.
you had
That's
said before.
exactly right. A
Yeah,
Goldwater.
yeah,
I wanted to say a Rockefeller Republican, and I knew that wasn't right.
right.
A
Yeah,
Goldwater Republican, which is even more conservative than a Rockefeller
right,
Republican by
right.
a long yard. And I really wasn't sure what about me that was eliciting this need in her to remind me that she is a Goldwater Republican. But whatever. She and I were perfectly cordial. There was never any animosity or strife between us. Um, but she and my wife and some of the other people in our on our block are in a reading club, a book club. And one night, I came home from work late. I was teaching a night course, and Nancy was in my home with a bunch of other of our neighbors, and Nancy wandered away from the book club conversation, and she wandered into the kitchen when I was eating the leftovers from the book club. Like I won there, um, and we had a long chat, and the long chat came from the fact that I remembered that she had told me that she's a vegan of 3 decades. And it really hadn't occurred to me until that night to ask her, what's a good, nice Rockefeller, Goldwater Republican like do with eating a vegan diet? And so I asked her. I didn't ask her that way, but I asked her sincerely. And it launched us into the most amazing intimate conversation about her real deep feelings about the well-being of animals. And she just can't bring herself to eat animals because she feels too much empathy for them, and to want to end their lives for the benefit of her nutritional needs
Right. Or desires.
or
Right.
desires, right? And that letting her talk to me about her motivations and what she cared about can it brought her around to asking me about my motivations and what I care about and why is it that I work on global warming. And it gave me an opportunity to tell her exactly why. And I don't really remember the details of this part of the conversation, but I'm pretty sure I couched it in who I am as a person and as a professional. I'm first, foremost, and always a public health professional. This is how I've spent the past 4 decades of my life, working on behalf of ensuring that we can all live a healthy and fulfilled lives. And explaining climate change to her as being rooted, why I'm working on it is because I am a health professional and I can't possibly stand by and watch us destroy the climate, which is the most fundamental determinant of human health. And being able to make my case to her and explain it from the perspective of my values made her comfortable enough to ask me a lot of follow-up questions that she had in her mind about global warming, but had never created the opportunity to ask anyone. But because we were having a real moment there, she felt comfortable asking me about the answer. Did I know the answer to these questions? And I would say we spoke for the better part of 45 minutes about this, and it was really a moment. I treasure it.
Yeah, I was thinking, we're going into the Thanksgiving season when people are going to have these interactions with people, and one does wonder, is what are some tips that you might recommend for having those for creating those moments, I guess. I mean, I guess you're looking for the common ground.
Yeah. I hear that question a lot,
Yeah, I'm
and
sure.
and behind the question, there's usually an assumption, and the assumption
Mm.
is, how can I win the argument?
Ah, okay.
And I think that's a really, really bad way to think about the whole thing. And it's totally understandable why
Right.
you would, if you
I'm
want to
alarmed.
engage. Right,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
You're alarmed, and lots of alarmed people would like to talk to their loved ones, their neighbors, their friends, their family, but they're worried that it will start a fight, and they're worried that they somehow have to, essentially become mini me climate scientists, and or be able to channel climate scientists to put all the facts on the table and win the debate. But that's just not the way it works. The way it works is you show people how much you care. And once you've shown them how much you care and why you care, then they might actually be interested in posing some questions and examining some, aspects of this that they otherwise really wouldn't be in the least bit interested in talking about it. So what I recommend is that if you want to talk to people about climate change, and I hope everybody wants to talk to people about climate change, just start with, telling people how much you care and why you care. And that's likely to lead to a really good conversation.
So it's funny as you were mentioning the thing about wanting to win an argument, which fair. I'm also thinking about like the sort of research that's been going on, and I've written a little bit about on climate misinformation, disinformation, and efforts to combat that. And I'm curious, what is your, it's an interesting arena because it brings in these areas of, of cognitive science and social psychology into the climate space. And there are all these like tactics that people are trying to counter with other kinds of tactics. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on how those efforts are moving forward. And you mentioned
So the
earlier, I know that you're like, well, God bless those people for.
No, no, no. This is a really important question,
Yeah.
and I'm going to couch the start of my answer in what I know as a public health communication scientist. Okay, so before I started working on climate change, I hold a degree in public health and another degree in communication science, and I did that very purposefully because I wanted my career to focus on how do we use communication to help people, not just ordinary people, but our policymakers in particular. How do we use information to help people make better decisions that will more reliably allow us to more people to live long and healthfully? And there's one and only one thing I know for sure in my 4 decades of study on that question, and that is every successful public health campaign in human history, probably every successful communication campaign of any type in human history has succeeded on the basis of having simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. And the trusted voices part is important because we don't necessarily all trust the same people, right?
Right.
So I would contend that Donald Trump is an absolute master of simple, clear messages, repeating them often through his own trusted voice and getting people in his milieu to repeat his simple, clear messages. And that was a very, very powerful driving force in America over the past 4 years and still is very much so. Much of what he's saying has no basis in truth, certainly no basis in scientific truth. But for those people who are trying to communicate scientific truths that will help people make better decisions, we have to use that same toolkit. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. It helps to get the repeated often part. It really helps to have a lot of money. So if I am, Royal Dutch Shell or BP or ExxonMobil or Chevron, I have a lot of money to spend to get my simple, clear messages out to the American people and people around the world. And right now, what do I want them to know? I want them to know that we've got this. We accept the fact that the climate is changing, but we are putting our best people and on the task of creating new sources of clean, renewable energy. So you folks don't need to worry about it. And it's a wonderful thing for them to tell me. I hear it every day on my NPR radio station. I see it in my Twitter feed. I feel like I'm surrounded 360 degrees by the fossil fuel industry telling me that they've got this thing. It's okay. But the way they do it is because they've got a lot of money to get message repetition. They literally pay to get their messages in front of me. The climate science community, they don't have that kind of budget. So and frankly, and we are not so good at the simple, clear messages
I was thinking
part.
that, yeah.
Yeah. So we have some work to do on simple, clear messages. Yeah, taking the complexity of climate change and climate solutions and rendering it simple. We've got a lot of work to do on getting the message repetition way up there. And if we can do those two things, though, simplify our messaging, make sure that we're finding ways to get those messages out frequently, the people who are most concerned about climate change, like you and me, we will actually incorporate that way of thinking and those messages into our own vocabulary, into our own dialogues with our friends and family. And that's really the power of simple, clear messages, because the most trusted people in all of our lives are the people who are closest to us. So it really helps when your messages are simple and clear, because members of your target audience will eventually become the conveyors of those messages. So coming back to answer your question, The climate denial industry has been shaping public understanding of climate change for many, many decades now. They've been talking about it for much longer than the climate science community. So we have a very hard job of undoing the damage that they have done in terms of shaping our understanding of climate change in ways that are fundamentally just not true, and fundamentally intended to make us not care about climate change, to make us think that it's a distant threat, not a
Or that
proximal
there's
threat,
nothing we can
and to
do.
make
I
us,
guess that's another, yeah.
or that there's nothing we can do, or that we should pay most attention to our own carbon footprint, which is completely ludicrous because while it is good to reduce our own carbon footprint, we're never going to solve this problem. We're never going to keep the warming to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees if what we're worried about is our individual footprints. What we need to worry about is making sure that every nation in the world has a real climate action plan, and that plan is focused laser-like on limiting global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is why the upcoming climate meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, COP26, is so incredibly important.
I was about to ask you, you're about to jet off to Glasgow, is that
I
right?
am.
To attend this meeting?
Yes.
Okay. And I was going to say, what are you looking for when you go to this meeting? What is your, this sort of is going to segue into a future question, what gives you hope? But I guess, for now, focused on this meeting, what needs to happen there in your view?
Yeah, okay. So it was a great thing. I'm actually going to start to introduce what gives me hope. The Paris Climate Agreement gave me hope because the Paris Climate Agreement was the first time that every nation in the world came together and agreed on a goal. The goal they agreed to, limiting climate change, limiting global warming to no more than 2 degrees, turns out to be not such a prudent goal, but at least it's a goal, right? We got that going for us, which is nice. But now we need to reset that goal down to 1.5 degrees C. And there are a lot of voices out there, including a lot of nations, that really aren't interested in lowering the goal, making a more ambitious goal of limiting to 1.5 degrees C. So it's incredibly important that as many science-based voices um, will be present at that meeting, fighting fighting for that, upping our game, going big, so that we can really try to limit the warming to something that could be reasonably considered safe for humanity. So what I'm hoping for is that countries will increase what are called their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. No country has to do anything. It's totally voluntary. But if in my case, I am going as a health professional. So if health professionals show up at the meeting and make it perfectly clear to our nation's leaders who are representing us at that meeting that we expect them to become more aspirational. We expect them to fight hard, not only to make bigger, more ambitious NDCs, but to push other nations to do the same. So that's what I'm hoping will happen at COP26. And, that gives me hope that there's still a chance that we can have an impact. Every tenth of a degree of warming that we avert will pay profound dividends, profound benefits for humanity. So I don't want to pretend as if there's something magical about 1.5 or 2 degrees C, but every tenth of a degree of warming that we can prevent is going to be really a blessing to humanity going forward.
Yeah, so I guess, the flip side, it's been a really tough couple of years, really exhausting and grueling, both due to COVID and for, extreme weather events and, having hopes sometimes feeling dashed about climate progress. So I guess, I wanted to ask first, what are your climate anxieties? What do you feel discouraged about? And then, the flip side of that is like, how do you counter that for yourself, I guess? How do you reach for that hope, even in the middle of
Yeah.
this I don't know what the word is, mess.
Yeah. Yeah. No, right now I feel most discouraged that one, possibly two US senators are in a position to essentially put the kibosh on what otherwise would have been a really thoughtful, appropriate, ambitious comprehensive climate package called the Back Better Act. It's just really perplexing to me I recognize that this is obviously a hyperpolarized issue, and that elected officials want to keep their jobs, so they want to make sure that they are not stepping out in front of and running afoul of their constituents. But this is an all hands on deck moment here, and we have a moment in America where we could really do what is necessary to not not do everything that is necessary, but take a major first step towards comprehensive climate action that will make us, for the first time, a real leader in the world. And the world needs real leaders right now. I don't have a, I don't think Americans should have sort of that sense that the world can't do it without us, but we are so big. Our economy is so big. We have been such major uh, carbon polluters for so long. We have an obligation to be leaders. It's not just that we can, but we have an obligation to do it. So I'm a little bit dispirited right now that it looks like the comprehensive climate legislation won't go through. But I also try to take the long view and realize, okay, we'll just means we have to work harder and hope to create enough public will, to create enough political will, so that next year or the year after or the year after, we will see the U.S. Congress do what is really necessary.
Well, I certainly am reaching for that hope as well. I agree. I feel a little bit dispirited, but I'm trying to sort of, take the long view. I think that maybe that's the only way to sort of move forward, and the idea of also, trying to connect with people, and do what we can to build that story, and get the information out to people, even in the middle of, even, and maybe not the dismissive folks, but the rest of the folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To answer your question about how do I contain my own anxieties so I can continue to be productive, I have a dear friend. She's an emergency room physician in Yellowknife, Northern Territories, Canada, and her name is Courtney Howard. And Courtney says, I don't worry anymore. I just do the work. And I love that. I love when she says that. I wish I were like her. I do still worry, but the way I try to contain my worry so that I can continue to do the work is I've created a mental lockbox. And whenever I get new information to help that I feel is important to update my own understanding of where we are with regard to our changing climate and what our most attractive solution options are, I open up the box. I pay attention to the information, and then if it's dire information, I shove it back in the box, and then I slam the box shut, and I leave it shut. And I only open it when I need to update the information that's in there. And the rest of the time, I just focus on giving my best shot at trying to help people, mostly Americans, but to some degree, my work is focused in around the world, especially in my work with health professionals. I try to focus on doing my best work today, and I find that that's enormously, I don't know, cathartic. I guess in a sense, staying in the present allows me to give my best shot every day.
I was
Yeah,
finding that thought grounding. Yes.
yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Dr. Maybach, thank you so much for such an informative and eye-opening conversation. And viewers, you can learn more about Dr. Maybach's work and keep up with the latest research on climate change by visiting us at sciencenews.org and connecting with us on social media. So thanks for joining us, and thank you again.
Thank you, Carolyn.